Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 67, Political Philosophy, and we are doing, this is week 11. We are doing this week this very interesting book, right? Willing Slaves of Capital by Frederick Lordon. And so if you go to the syllabus, you see that I call this class for today, for this week, Passionate Servitude. And I will start with that. I want to only give you a few pointers, call attention to a few important concepts, moments in this book. First of all, the title itself, the English title, is a bit misleading. The French title is different, and Willing Slaves of Capital, Lordon, the writer, says he repeats that actually there is never really voluntary servitude. So one is not a willing slave. There is no voluntary servitude, but there is always passionate servitude. Okay, that's the words that I use for the class for this week. Passionate servitude, which is based on the emotions, the passions. Fear, for example. We do very often things out of fear. The typical example is when during an election people vote for one person only because they fear what might the consequences otherwise be. For example, people voting for a so-called strong man, right? Very often reactionary person. In maybe the tradition that we saw starting with Hobbes, Smith, and so on, right? For fear of things like otherwise people come from abroad, migration, the migrants come, people coming and stealing our jobs and so on and so forth, the fear of an invasion and so on and so forth. This fear, for example, but fear is one of the most fundamental, of course, important emotions in our life. There are others as well. So they always determine the actions that we do. They condition us. So the idea that we are free is false ultimately, right? This freedom is always the result of a series of determinations. There is no free will that we do as we please, but very often we act out of on the basis of the emotions, on the basis of the passions, and very often, because that's the idea, the main idea in this book is why would people ultimately settle for a situation of bondage and servitude rather than freedom, right? Why very often people don't really try to liberate themselves, and this is what Lordon, ultimately deals with by he bases his argument on especially Spinoza and Marx. We have studied Marx in this class, some things, from Marx. We haven't done Spinoza. I teach Spinoza in my modern philosophy class. So, but in any case, you can gather some important moments. Very simplistically, for Spinoza, there is this idea that we are in a condition, situation of servitude or bondage vis-a-vis the emotions, but we can learn how to master the emotions, how to manage the emotions, and move from servitude, from bondage to liberation and freedom. That is to say, also, there are these two very important, the most important perhaps, emotions in Spinoza that you find in Lordon as well. So I remark on this, I highlight this for this reason. Sadness on the one hand, and joy on the other. Think about the spectrum of all the emotions. Sadness close to situations of perhaps depression and so on, and joy on the other side, and they are the result of a decrease or an increase of our power to act. Power, not power in the political sense of power as domination and so on, that Spinoza rejects, and so does Lordon, but power as a potency, the power, the ability, the capacity to do things, to act, right? So the less active we are, the closer we move to sadness. The more active we are, the closer we move to joy. Okay, so ultimately it is up to us, in a sense. I mean, it is through reason, by thinking, that we can subvert. We are back to the question of subversion. This dialectic, if you will, that we study with Hegel, and move from sadness, and that is to say, from bondage, from servitude to joy, and that is to say, to thinking and freedom and liberation. Okay, so that's basically the idea. So to abandon this servitude that might look like voluntary, right? Because there is the question, another important concept, a pair of concepts, is that of coercion and consent. I mean, it appears as if people consent to something, but very often this consent is only a masked coercion, the coercion that we saw in Hobbes. I mean, to be obliged to do something, to be forced to do something. Very often we are forced to do things like work itself. We saw that with Marx, probably, right? And that seems to be free, but it is actually forced work, labor, and but that takes on the appearance of a consent. So it is as if we consented to our own enslavement, our own servitude, but it is ultimately a matter of coercion, and this coercion bases itself and uses the emotions, for example, fear of losing one's job, and so on and so forth, right? So all these things keep a certain order, a status quo, things like they were before in society. And this is the way in which Lordon uses precisely Spinoza in this sense, and then Marx, right? And we studied Marx, and the fundamental question of desire. What is it that we desire, right? I mean, why would then people desire, or they may seem to desire their servitude? Because maybe of security, right? That we saw that with Hobbes, right? Stability, security. Why would then people end up desiring, or apparently desiring servitude rather than freedom, liberation, and freedom? Okay, so that's a very important question, and so I highlighted already these important concepts: passionate servitude. Remember, it's never voluntary; it is always passionate, and that is a universal condition. You find that in Lordon, and then this coercion and consent, the playing over, right? Coercion and consent. That consent is actually a form, let's say, a masked form of coercion. And this comes through a whole precisely manipulation of the emotions or affections and desire, and also through domination, right? And we already saw the submission, and the idea of enlisting, right? That there are those, the boss. You will find the figure of the boss very interesting in Lordon. The boss, typically the person who's able to enlist others and make others do what they want, right? So that's basically what the system does, right? So, and it is this happens through there is another important so you find the figure of the boss, for example, on page 32, the concept of enlisting on page 30, and then the next pages as well. The question of joy that I called attention to, you find some, remarks on joy on page 27 and page 28. And then the question of this is a very important concept, very central concept in the book, co-linearization. Linear co-linearization, to put everybody in, in place to have people do something by, you know, by creating this dynamic, which is like a seriality, right? I mean, people do the same. I mean, it is, you know, and you find that on page 33. Maybe I can read some, at least some things, and let me go to the book, page 33, for example. The boss, this is actually page 32. At the end of page, the bottom of page 32, you have a reference, a passage about the boss. This is 5 lines from the bottom, speaking about alignment. This is evidently the obsession of the capitalist boss, but in a wider sense also the boss in general, as it is the very figure of a master desire. We spoke about the desire of the master when we did Hegel, right? And the work of the slave, namely of an enlister. Okay, so that's what the enlisting is. The master is able to enlist, right, to satisfy his her desire others, right? What we saw in with Hegel, the slave, the worker, with Marx, and so on. In the community family situation, housework, the context of housework, women, when we spoke about so-called women's work, right, in the male-centered society, right, patriarchal society. So, and he continues, the obsession with alignment. I'm reading from the bottom line of page 32. The obsession with alignment is simply the desire to turn the enlisted powers to a faithful extension of one's own power. Okay, so the boss is able to make others do the work for him, just like in Hegel, very similarly, right? It is particularly visible in small capitalist businesses where bosses and employees are in daily contact with one another. And then he speaks about this meta desire. Then he goes into the question of tyranny, power, and also fear that I mentioned. Collinearization, you find that word, and I highlighted that for you regularly, many times throughout the book. For example, on page precisely 34, you had that word already. Okay, I think it's 34. 33. Okay, and then on page 34 there is this interesting section called the intensification of a fear, and on page 35, for example, the word co-linearization, the expression is used at least twice. Then on the beginning of page 36, you had this idea of a forced cooperation and so on. I can't, of course, read everything together, but you find the question of consent and right. I mean, think about chapter 2. I didn't mention, right, the chapters, the titles are also important, because they are pointers, conceptually speaking. Chapter 1 is called Making Others Do Something, this enlisting that I spoke of. Chapter 2, that begins on page 49, joyful automobiles, employees, and so on. And then chapter 3 later, domination, liberation. Okay, so but in any case, the beginning of chapter 2 is very interesting, and so you read that, and it is then on page 44, 45, that you find the idea of coercion and consent already. Okay, so I spoke a little about that, but and I hope that is clear that consent is only it's the same as coercion, right? Um, and I read from the bottom of page 44, the last lines. The sociology or social psychology of work is indeed full of references to these facts, a strange one relative to the atmosphere of coercion they used to surround work. This new voluntary servitude, in scare quotes, remember this is never the case. It's never voluntary, it's always passionate. Whose mechanisms he would like to study, this form of servitude that is obviously special, since in fact the enslaved consent to it. But make sure that this, I mean, I hope this is clear, that you grasp that this consent, as he says at the end of then the next page, right, page 45, the very last line, and I highlighted that for you. Consent does not exist, right? It is always ultimately a matter of coercion. On the next page, he goes into Spinoza, and then all this is very important, very interesting. On page 48, you had the section called Joyful Obedience. The one obeys, but one is supposed to obey in a joyful way, right? I mean, you have to show that you are happy. That's also part of affective labor, right? I mean, the effort that we put into doing something, right? The emotional effort, right? So this happy obedience, right, which is what the system requires people to actually show that they have, right? I mean, so at the end of page 50, toward the bottom of that page, you, I read this sentence. I'm reading: coercion and consent are forms of the lived experience, respectively, sad and joyful, of determination. Okay, we are determined. We can be determined in one way or the other. So that's also key in the book, and I want to, then move to this other moment, which is really the end, of the book. In the last chapter, how do we change? How does anyone change? How does one change direction? How do you change the direction of determination, right? How do you move from servitude and sadness toward liberation? How do you change the direction of your desire and move toward liberation and therefore joy? That's interesting, right? I mean, you have, for example, on page 107, I skip many pages, but you read, especially, don't worry about the graphs and so on. Read especially the highlighted sections, right, that I did for you. And page, I believe, I wanted to read from okay, this is page actually 98. Okay, this is a very important passage, so you can use that as well to write then your assignments. Both the discussion journal entries are, very much related to what we are reading in Lordon this week. When the indignation that gets people moving prevails over the obsequium. You can Google that word, but obsequium is a kind of a obedience and reverence towards something, right? That makes them stay put. A new affective vector, so a change in the direction of desire, is formed, and individuals who used to be determined to respect, that's obsequium, respect, right? Institutional norms, for example, those over the employment relation, are suddenly determined to sedition, right? So it is again the movement that we saw before in the course of this semester, if you will, between capture, right? Because this is colonialization, is a form of capture, right? Servitude. So the movement from capture to subversions of one's situation, conditions, therefore lines of flight, moving toward a different direction, and this different direction is precisely freedom instead of servitude. It is joy instead of sadness. And actually, the last page I find always very interesting when I read this. You know, the very last page, which is page 111. I read a few lines and then I wrap it up there. This is from the top of the page. To liberate individuals from the custody, sad or joyful, of the master desire. Remember, there can be this kind of joyful, no, obedience, happy obedience, to the extent possible. And think about the examples of that. I mean, people who do things because they are forced to do them, but then they construct a kind of fantasy world in which they tell themselves that that's what they want to do. Exactly that they do it happily, that they are not forced, right? Again, I may also not be aware of the fact that I am in a condition of bondage and servitude, right? So I had to become aware of that to begin with. So, to the extent possible, and even if final liberation is only a horizon, it's not only to do away with the asymmetries of the capture. He uses the concept of capture often, and so on, but to open possibilities for the future, right? So, and this is very important, very much. It's very close to the philosophy of Spinoza. I hope that in a very sketchy, you know, too sketchy way, I gave you a sense of what Spinoza does with the emotions, right? And Marx, he says the common life. Lord on, I'm reading the common life, right? The the community, the common life is not a choice that people are free to reject, right? I mean, by and large, people live in communities, right? The endogenous forces of their passionate lives lead them to it necessarily, beginning with the requisites for reproducing their material lives, right? That people had to then ultimately live together. That's the beginning of a no, right society, community. We saw that with Hobbes, with his hypothetical and fictional moment, but the relations, that's the point, okay? I mean, yeah, people live together, but the how can be different, right? I mean, the relations that govern the organization of this common life are neither written in advance nor given for all eternity, and it is thus permitted to prefer some over others. In other words, what we spoke about in this class from the beginning, the question of power relations that can be subverted, can be changed, right? The form of governance that people have can be different, right? I mean, there are many ways in which people can regulate their life, their common communal life, and therefore also individual life. So it is not only one way. Think about very often we hear, oh no, we need, like Hobbes was proposing, we need and Smith, this strong government and so on and so forth. Otherwise, there is chaos, there is anarchy, and so on and so forth. But the idea is something can be invented which is new. Again, the relations that govern the organization of the community, they can be chosen, they can be constructed in a different way. I mean, ultimately, if the human world is made, right, that's the idea, it can be unmade and made differently. So the question for us doing political philosophy is there an alternative? Yes, of course, there must be, right? That's what the book is also about. Okay, so let me know if you have questions, and then next time we have the last week. And remember that this being a writing intensive class, the last essay will be done into, right? There are two drafts of it. Okay, but that's for the last week. Okay, next week. Okay, thank you. Bye.